Hey, today I'll be showing you how to change the rear shock on 2013/2015 Lexus GS350. Begin by opening the trunk and removing a part of your trim so you could get your hands behind to where the shock is mated and attached to the body. So there's only a couple of clips to remove. There is a clip here. There's another clip and a clip right here. Now, no need to remove anymore, so just take your hand, pull it back, and you will see this. So I already removed these three nuts. These are 14 millimeter. 1, 2, 3. So this is the actual shock mount, and this is the actual shock mounted in the mount. Next step is remove the wheel after you've jacked up the car, and this is the shock. You could see it going into the trunk and slowly coming in and attaching itself to the control arm. Now, it is attached using a nut and bolt. I've pre-gamed this a little bit by lubricating it all, so it'd be easier to take off, but that's how it works. To remove it here, you will need to do two things. You'll need to hold it on one side and undo it on the other side. That way the other side does not spin. You're gonna use a 19 millimeter socket. Out it comes. Lubrication does wonders. I highly suggest you lubricate everything before you start undoing things, especially around the suspension, because everything's usually corroded. On the other side, see my shock, that's the bolt. I'm going to be banging it out on the other side. Alright, out came the bolt. Looks a little corroded. I wish I could replace it, but I never ordered a spare. But still in good shape. I'm going to give it a douse with some oil and let it absorb before I put it back in. So at this point, the shock is disengaged both from the top in the trunk and here at the control arm. Next step, you're gonna wiggle it out, but before you do, because the shock is mounted into a rubber mount and that's, you know, beneath this trim, let's remove a couple of nuts holding the trim so I could actually pull the trim back and then wiggle this thing in and out. 10 millimeter. Plastic. Okay, all right. See. And it's pretty soft, so it gives you a lot of wiggle room. You could actually look up there and see where the shock enters the trunk. To finally remove the shock, and this part is the trickiest, you're gonna grab the bellows or the dust boot to which the shock is attached through the shock mount. Using your strength with both hands, pull it down, because presumably if your shock is bad, it shouldn't be that hard to actually pull it all down and compress it, and then slowly take it out, kind of like wiggle it out this way towards the wheel well, right? Another way I think you can do this is you can grab the shock itself with both hands, compress it upward, and then move it out of the control arm. So either way I think is good. I tried doing that way first yesterday. On the other side, it didn't work well for me. And then I managed to simply grab the boot, pull it down, and wiggle it out, and that worked for me. So that's what I'm gonna do now. Always remember that because you have the car jacked up and you have a stand, you can jack up or down to move the suspension positioning, which gives you sometimes a lot more, and it gives you the necessary clearance for you to get parts in and out of the way. Very important. I'm jacking the car up to give me the maximum amount of space. The shock is going to be pretty much fully extended, and it'll make it far easier for me to compress it a little bit and slide it out. It's still not easy, but it becomes doable. Okay, something's coming out. All right. Just wiggled it out. Now it's time to take it out of the wheel well. Be careful not to scratch your car. It's easy to do. All right, so how how can we tell that the shock is bad? Well, first of all, I can easily compress it with my hands. Secondly, when you compress it, it doesn't come back, or it comes back slowly, which is not right. Now, the good thing is, you see, these are originals and they are KYB. So when you're changing shocks or struts, don't necessarily go out and buy the LEXUS ones. You're going to pay 6 times more. Just get good aftermarket KYBs. Because as you can see, if they're the original equipment inside a LEXUS, then no need to purchase a LEXUS branded shock or strut. So let me show you something. So, and that's the shock mount itself. See, not, you know, it's in pretty good shape considering it's 10 years old, but then again, this part is always inside the car. This part's a little dirty, it looks somewhat rusted, but I don't think its function is impacted. Once again, once the new shock is inside the dust boot and inside the shock mount, it'll be mounted inside the wheel well. This part will hug the body, and these 3 bolts will come inside the trunk. So that's how it looks. Quite simple. Changing the rears is a lot simpler than changing the fronts because the shock is not embedded within the spring. The spring is separate. So this is the old dust boot that I pulled out of the car. And this is the new one. This part is important because the shock goes into it, through it, and attaches to the body. It's important for 2 reasons. The dust boot obviously prevents dust and moisture and all kinds of crap from, you know, getting into the shock's most vulnerable surface, which is this one, right? Secondly, inside it has what's known as, see that light thing? It's a rubbery bump stop. A bump stop prevents the shock from bottoming out when you hit a pothole. So obviously it's extremely important, and these things do tend to wear out with time. Secondly, this is called the shock cushion. It's a piece of rubber, right? Cushions. Notice this one's 10 years old, this one's brand new. Look at the size of it, right? One's obviously compressed, old, and the other one is not. It's important to change because this absorbs a lot of the noise and the vibration coming from the wheel, the road, and prevents it from being carried further into the cabin. Now, since we're already removing the shock and changing it, another thing to consider replacing when doing your shock is the end link. The end link connects your stabilizer bar, which is a large metal bar connecting the 2 sides of the car, to your control arm. In some cases, at least in the front, the link connects to the actual strut. The point of this thing is to maintain a balance. So the stabilizer bar, when you're turning or swerving, keeps the car level. These tend to wear out. The only thing to know about it is when you're unbolting them, you have to hold the inner nut with a socket, not a socket, but a wrench, while you undo the outer part. Slide it out, slide the new one in, and that's it. The end link is an 18mm. As I've stated earlier, use penetrating oil before you work. It does wonders. It'll make your life a hell of a lot easier. Alright, so I removed the end link. So this is the stabilizer bar, and this is the end link. It looks cruddy, old. It might be failed because it's all oily, and there's actually grease inside. So when these things fail, grease comes out, and yeah, it looks pretty corroded. And here, by comparison, is the new one, right? Look at the difference. Just the sheer difference. It's a little bit hard to get out, so you're gonna have to play around with it. It is doable because the spring kind of gets in the way. So before you put the shock back on, it is when you really should be replacing this. To help you wiggle this thing around, particularly at the bottom where it's very close to the spring, always remember that each of these arms you can move around like this, and that'll help you greatly. So if you move it, it'll give you enough wiggle room to get the end link out. I'd like to remind you that this work is as much about finesse as it is about brute strength. So if you position the suspension in a proper way, you have enough clearance to get an impact with an extension in there and simply to tighten up the bottom bolt. It's very easy to do. So I tighten up the bottom bolt somewhat. Now I'm gonna tighten up the top and then tighten both of them together. As always, everything that you spin has to be held on the other side to prevent the counter spin. So put an 18 on here and tighten up with another 18. Make sure that both ends, right, hugging the sway bar are flush, because if your level's off and this thing goes in at an angle, clearly, you know, it's not going to be in full contact with the sway bar. All right, it is time to put the shock back in. So first thing is we're going to put the shock mount in from the bottom and get the nuts seated. Everything's straight down the middle there. Yeah, look correct. It's not fun, but it's doable. When you compress, you need a lot of strength, but you have to do it slowly. There's no way you're gonna quickly compress this. It compresses. Boom. You see? Now it's in its position. Since I'm fully extended at this point, the strut isn't, the shock is not reaching the top of the wheel well, so it's not going in inside the trunk, but I'm gonna slowly lower it. Well, it's not that slow, but slow enough. Boom. You see? The top of the shock is now inside the car, not firmly, because I haven't lowered it fully yet, but it is inside the car. So before I fixate it in place, I need to lower the car sufficiently. Before I lower everything completely, let's give you a better look. You see? The shock mount, and the shock is in it. Right now it's not exactly firm and flush, but before I lower it, I just want to make sure I'm more or less in the vicinity in the center. That's what I'm going to do. Alright, let's get this. So this is the last part. I actually didn't show you this before, but this is the last piece. Goes right in the middle, right? This ensures that this whole structure is in the middle, not off center somewhere. So I'm going to get this going, get it seated before I tighten it. And now I am reasonably sure that my shock is positioned properly. And now I can more or less, without fear, start lowering the car. But then again, not yet, because I have not yet put the bolt through the bottom there, which is what I'm going to do now. Alright, I got the bolt through, so I'm putting the nut on. Attached at the bottom. It's time to fix in place the shock mount. Okay, and 17mm for this top piece, which is gonna connect the top of the shock to the shock mount. And keep that shock in place, not moving anywhere. All right, everything seems to be in place. Let's put the trim back in. I love using impacts if I could get away with it. The best purchase I've ever made was buy a small and large impact. Honestly, it just makes working on the car so much simpler. I can't even tell you how much physical strength it would take for me to do a lot of this work using a breaker bar in tight confined spaces where there's very little and almost no clearance. Shock is in place because I've tightened it up with that one bolt and this bolt down here. Nut and bolt. Nothing's in the way. I didn't have to remove anything. All right, I think we are ready to put the wheels back on. I want to tell you that when you do this, your car will sit taller. It'll sit higher. Like right now, the clearance is kind of insane. It looks unnatural, but then again, it is a four-wheel drive. Part of the reason is obviously you have new parts, right? They're not compressed like the old piece of rubber I showed you was. The second part is that your shocks and your struts up front carry some of the weight of the car. So it's not all on the springs. It's also on the shocks and struts. So obviously when your shocks and struts are dead, they're not carrying any weight. So your car is entirely sitting on its springs, which is why it handles like crap. And trust me, you will know that it handles like crap anytime you go over uneven surfaces. We took a ride. An hour has passed. I think the car settled in a little bit. I hear no noises. I hear no sounds. I feel more control from the back. So I think everything worked.